I know I look familiar. I know you've seen me on TV. Everybody calls me Chuck Todd. Just joking. All right, so let's jump into this. I'm going to ask these guys some questions, this distinguished panel. And I know all these guys. I met them already, so we're just going to jump right into it. And my first question is going to be a part 2 question. What is your role in data collection and analysis? And what are some of the biggest challenges and roadblocks that you guys have run into harnessing the data and actually turning this into actionable intelligence? So with that, I'll get started. Trey, I'll let you get started on that first.
Sure. Really excited to be here today. Data is such a burgeoning area, and I've been involved in data for quite some time. My role is at the General Services Administration. I'm the program manager for strategic data initiatives. In that role, I manage several large government data sets around mission support services. I also serve on the Federal Data Strategy project team with OMB. And in terms of, challenges is the next one? Yeah, so challenges, I really see 3 really big challenges in the work that I do. One is around data quality. If you don't have good quality data, it's really hard to do anything with it. The second is, I will say that there is a big challenge around standards, which links back to quality. So if you don't have good standards, good definitions for the data that you're collecting, then it can be very difficult to do anything with it, to connect disparate data sets, et cetera. And then finally, another big challenge that I have, in particular in doing government-wide data analysis, is getting access to data. So I'm trying to get access from other agencies often for data. And I actually even have challenges getting access to data sometimes within my own agency. And I know that I'm not alone in that. And then finally, I'll say one more thing before we move on, and that is that I think that the communities of data scientists and people who are not data, or data professionals, I should say, and people who are not data people need to learn how to talk and work together better. I find that they don't often understand each other to the extent that they need to. So I could say more on that later. But.
All right, Damian, you want to follow up on that?
All right, so I'm Damian Kostiuk. I'm Division Chief for Data Analytics with our relatively brand new Chief Data Officer's Office at U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, part of DHS, if you're not familiar. Damian. And say some of my background is actually I kind of worked with data, whether it was on the IT side or on the business side. And always the orientation, I hear that theme, I think probably throughout here, is exactly how to make these data applied. And I'll actually slingshot right into the challenging component of that.
All right.
I'd say, especially if there's ears perked about thinking about how we apply some of these things in government, to iterate off of the fact that we need to get all the data in one place as much as possible. And I'll absolutely say, and this will be my lead into the next part where we actually talk about the applied area, I'd say that probably the most critical catalyst for us to actually get our data into a way that we could actually find some actual decision-making capabilities and operational performances was to finally actually get the data in one place. And it actually started with the analytics, not with the systems-to-systems connection. Example, right, whatever analytical tool you might be using, whether it's SAS or SPSS or whatever you're using, just the fact that we finally got all the connectors into there was the single catalyst that finally got a bunch of data scientists, and humans, right, we're creative little crazy people, right, and we'll needle in there and try and find stuff whether someone's asking or not. And ultimately we found ways, there were creative people around that were able to then take all those disparate pieces, finally that they've never been able to connect the dots before, they finally connected the dots, and we were able to solve some problems that were able to like reduce some of our manual operations by like 86%. So there's the kind of things I'll say is a kind of a forewarning, but the big challenge, the loop back with that, with the challenge was getting the data into one place was like the first key catalyst. Then after that, we'll have all kinds of discussions about microservices architecture and other stuff like that if you want to. But And also certain expectations, I'd say, is the last challenge that I'd definitely put out there we're seeing right now. Are people, for instance, like in our OCC and our chief counsel's office, and also, let's say that they're a problem, but saying that the orientation, too many people have seen things around like the TEDx talks, that somehow, a trained data scientist thrown to a problem can solve cancer in 2 weeks. Right? Doesn't, no, please understand that a good machine learning model takes like a year to really fully bake and get to the kind of the level of precision you need to actually solve some problems in a defensible way. And I'm kind of tethering off an earlier conversation. I want to emphasize defensible way, because just throwing like Watson or some neural net at a problem is not going to solve your problem in a lot of government operations. So with us, for instance, where we approve and deny benefits for immigration, it better be defensible. So a neural net where it's practically indefensible in a court of law is not a good way to go. So something like a decision tree where you have very defensible audit trails as to why the algorithm chose the parameters that did, the features that it did for what parameters, those are defensible. You can go into a court of law and prove that. And that is a big challenge, I'd say, in terms of the development cycle time, expectation setting, and working with your chief counsel's office and things like that, and understanding that these takes time, and that there are certain parameters around it, that it's not data mining, it's not this, it's other things. But I'll leave that for later.
All right. Jesse?
I'm laughing because I'm sitting next to my kindred spirit here. So Jesse Rollins, I'm one of the lead data scientists at DLA, under our CDO office as well. So I came on a year and a half ago to kind of help lead the charge for artificial intelligence, data science. And so when it comes to data, I'm one of the lead consumers, right? And so I spend a lot of time building requirements and working with our data strategists and our CDO to kind of help shape where we're going to go with this data. And a lot of my concerns were already kind of mentioned here, but just to back up, what's my lead concern, right? What's the big problem? Well, I've got a bunch when it comes to AI. I got governance, expertise, computer infrastructure. But the longest problem is going to be data, right? And when it comes to data, what my real problem is I've got a bunch of data and not a lot of resources. So we hear all the time, like, we've got to fix the data. We've got to fix the data. Great, you're never going to fix the data. No way. Data is growing too quickly, and besides, it's not worth it to fix all of the data. So we've kind of had this mindset of, all right, let's get all the data in one place. And I kind of think of data and systems as like a hay bale. In there is a needle of information, a model I need to extract some type of value. And the old way of doing things, and I think we're kind of there, is getting all these hay bales in the same barn to where someone can look at all of them. And so instead of fixing every single hay bale, we need to throw some out. Right? I've got limited resources, I've got limited time. So where's the value? So when it comes to data, my biggest beef is, how do I create a system to triage all of this? I'm never going to fix everything, but what's the biggest data set that we use? What's the most valuable to management? And let's start there. You hear this idea of treating data as an asset. I don't think I've seen that really successfully done anywhere. So I'm also a CPA, and like in my previous life, I was an auditor, so shout out to the GAO. And anyone from the IRS in here, we can be friends. And so when you hear data as an asset, I go back to my accounting days thinking of what's an asset. Well, if you ask an accountant what an asset is in a company who's passing their audit, they have something called like an asset ledger, where we have records of all of our biggest assets, right? So what's our most material assets? When did we buy them? Where are they at? How much are they worth? How much are they worth? Who owns them? How do I get access to them, right? We have all this information. But when you go in, you talk about, well, we're trying to treat data as an asset. Okay, where's your asset ledger? Do you know where it's at? How much is it worth? Why are you keeping this on? What's the ROI? So to me, creating that system where I can triage the data, throw out stuff that maybe isn't worth it, cuts down a lot of work for our analysts. If we can get that in one spot, then I can focus on what's important. We're never going to fix everything, so we need to triage.
Okay. So it sounds like you guys have things, you address things like bridging the gap between technical side and the business side. You run into those issues, data trapped in vertical apps. So do you have, or how do you, have you seen any organizations overcome these issues or those types of challenges? For example, like you got collaborative issues. How do you address those types of things? I'll start with you, my friend.
Yeah. I think first and foremost, you need to start with the business questions that are driving the analysis. And also, I think it even helps prioritize what you focus on, because as Jesse said, you can't focus on everything. You need to pick and choose. So first of all, the topic areas from the business questions, that's where you want to focus. The business questions help to drive the analysis, help you decide what you are going to concentrate on getting into that one place, the one system. And also, I think, related to that, having one version of the truth, because I've seen a lot of problems occur when you have replicated data systems that are following different business rules, et cetera. And related to that, I think, again, we go back to how do the two communities work together, and it's a bit of an oversimplification to put them in two buckets, but I will for the case of this discussion, where you have the data professionals on the one hand, and you have the non-data folks, the line employees, managers, SES, and the other. The business questions really help to bring them together. I'll say that from the data, on the data side, I see a lot of very impressive data scientists coming up who can do amazing things. And machine learning, AI, those are very powerful tools. But sometimes I also see that there's a lack of understanding of how to focus on the business questions. Data is so process-oriented that it's really easy to get pulled in to the process and get down in the weeds and forget why we're doing things. So business questions help focus on that. On the other side, I think that for the non-data people, we need to focus on a kind of a baseline data literacy. And it's not just with things like AI and machine learning, because I also have run into situations where people think that you let out an AI bot into the data lake and it brings back insight. And it doesn't work like that. We all know that it takes a lot of intervention, it takes a lot of subject matter expertise to get an algorithm to work correctly. But also with even basic data concepts, I think we all need to raise our game. Just basic things like correlations and regression equations. I think we're not going to turn everybody into a data scientist. We don't want to, but leaders need to understand how they can use these tools effectively. And I think a certain level of data literacy, we need to bring people along.
Good. Damian?
So certainly off of the idea of coordination, that kind of spins me on a slight tangent, so I'll go on to it.
It's okay.
Which is that this is a current problem. I'm queuing off the idea of data literacy, but also the general idea of spreading the word of data. Most of our operations, for instance, and a lot of government operations have been so paper-based, right? People think of data in a very different way. One of the things I feel like, if I'm going to throw out something in terms of coordination, I love using the term self-regulating policies, meaning, if you try to write a piece of paper and you put it out as a memo and you cast it out across like a good old-fashioned government agency, people look at it, think about it, but if it's not in the frontal lobe every single day, every single moment, it will be forgotten pretty quickly, and you'll start to see all kinds of deviations, which is why we have data quality problems and all kinds of other stuff like that. But so when I think of self-regulating policies, I'm also thinking of the communications techniques and tools. So example, there are some things that seem so simple, like on a strategic plan. Historically, like a lot of agencies, they'll say okay, will you divisions and directorates and components, can you please give us a conceptual alignment between these two elements, between the agency goal and the and your individual agency subcomponent goal. But they've never asked for it to be a quantitative correlation between it. So you're talking about regressions and correlation coefficients and stuff like that. Well, you can fit a bus in a conceptual alignment, but you can't necessarily do that if you have to show that there's actually an effect power. You have to be able to show that there's a correlation, right? If your correlation is 0, then there's probably something you're not doing. So anyway, I'm kind of going on this train thinking about it, but the idea of how do you coordinate across disparate people who can't all talk with each other and no one's omnipotent. So the only way you can really deal with that, I feel like, I'm seeing in our environment, is where you have to cast these little tiny pieces of requirements within the network, and then that causes people, whether they know it or not, to basically be forced into certain pathways in the proverbial chess game of organizations. And anyway, so maybe, I don't know, I'll stop at that point, because I feel like if there's any kind of add-on, because everything else I would say, yes, I agree with Trey.
Okay. All right, Jesse, your turn, big guy.
I mean, we have the same problems. I mean, the data literacy problem. If your management doesn't understand the technology, and doesn't have to have an in-depth understanding, but has to know fundamentally what's going on. Like, if you've never driven a car and you try to explain a car to someone who's never seen one, driven one, have no idea, then how can they be expected to make a decision about it? Right. So that's something we kind of do a lot at DLA, where I go around traveling and giving a lot of talks about AI and how it's going to affect managers, workforce, stuff like that. And that gives a lot of return on the value, I think, because as soon as people understand fundamentally how the technology works, they can think back to their business and say, could we do this? Could we do this? Could we do this? And that's something that you'll never get out of your data scientists. Your data scientists will never understand your business. They're not supposed to. They're reading research papers all day and coding. If you want to take them away from that and make them learn the business, that's fine. Their ability is going to go down. So I think there's kind of this cross-pollination that needs to happen, right? Your business leaders need to understand the technology. And I think you were right when your data scientists have to work a lot with subject matter experts, but I think a lot of that knowledge needs to come out of the subject matter experts. You need to get that written down somewhere. You need to get the context of the data in a system, not in a person. So a lot of time we spend with a new project, okay, our analysts are going to sit down with the subject matter expert and we're going to hash out what the data is, what the meaning is over hours, days, months. We can't do that anymore. There's too much data, there's too little time. I need all that business context out of the people and into a system. So somehow I have to get a cross-pollination of that information. And I think one of the key ways is we do that is if you have someone who can straddle both. So that's a lot of my job right now is I came from an operations side, I can do the data science side, not as well as a data scientist, who's like, all they do is a PhD and read code all day. That's not me.
Okay.
I'm also not fully operations. I haven't grown up in operations for 30 years, but I can straddle the middle. I can take both sides, translate into what that actual business problem is. And so without those bridges, like you said, I don't think we're going to get anywhere.
Okay. Gotcha. Jeff, thanks for showing up.
Thank you.
See you. So you missed the first question, or the second question, so I'll redo the question. We were talking about harnessing data and actually turning it into actionable intelligence. So what I just asked the group was how they overcome those particular challenges.
I mean, for us, we're all about generating the data and kind of doing a we call it really kind of first line data extraction, and that's the data is generated for that. So most of our complex work is that second level data extraction, where the data is then standardized and put in a position where people can then utilize it. So I would say that's pretty much what we're mostly focused on. I mean, we don't have the complexity that you just mentioned, where we have like bioinformaticists, so they're data scientists who understand biology. So they're a little closer to the actual reason it was created, but I think for us, it was really driven by genomics, basically. Genomics is a very standard data set. DNA is very simple. It's not complex. Doesn't have multi-dimensionality to it. It's just a sequence. Yeah. And so that really started to get everybody thinking, well, if we shared this, it's pretty much, there's not a lot of complexity to it. Unfortunately, I think they really haven't gotten to the point where now they're thinking, well, yeah, we can share all this data. I'm like, oh, there's a lot of complexity in that data. How you collected it. And so what we really are working on, I would say now, is I think we've got a lot of the physical things done, the cloud, the storage models. What we don't really have is the standardized metadata models for understanding exactly the nuance of the data collection.
Okay. All right, next question, guys. Can any of you share a few examples of successful programs or initiatives that were actionable insights made a real world difference within your organizations?
So again, my role is a little different in that I'm working on government-wide data. And in the work that I've done there, we've had some positive impact in a number of areas. I'll highlight a few of them. One is that a specific example, we collected a lot of data on invoices, for example, and we were able to demonstrate that automation of invoices, which shouldn't be surprising, but it was to some people apparently, is much more efficient than doing manual input of invoices. That data was used to help drive an OMB guidance on invoice automation a few years ago. We also we manage a government-wide customer satisfaction survey on mission support services, which helps shine the light on problems within hiring, recruiting and hiring. That data was also used to help with the hiring excellence initiative that OPM started. From a specific agent, because our data is actually used by agencies as well to improve their operations. So specifically from that perspective, I will mention that our data on mission support services was used to help baseline cost and quality of mission support services for the Department of Commerce when they started their shared services center a few years ago. So those are just a few examples of how we've been able to help.
Great. You know, I like the mantra from the Nobel Peace Prize stuff, where they say, you know, an idea is good if it can solve a tailored, targeted problem, but an idea is great if it suddenly becomes known to be useful across a much broader context than was ever imagined possible. So I'll put that in the context of some solutions that we've done, actually. Example, we produced, we used some machine learning to produce one of our first kind of full-scale solutions where we used a full, complete package of microservices architecture and developed different entity resolution models for a number of different circumstances. And at first the original purpose was for one targeted, narrow space. But then suddenly people realized, wait a minute, this thing is actually pretty general. We can use this thing on a number of different problems across the whole agency. Now this one single solution now has API connections and is now tagged to a number of different things, solving problems that were way beyond, let's say, the person space or solving resolution for organizations. Basically, and all of that then nurtured yet another evolution, which is a whole suite of graph DBs, graph databases, and the ability to finally join disparate data so you can find obvious and non-obvious relationships between data. So from this small little kernel, it spread out, and I just love that for that use case. But it all kind of came together with a number of different other kind of complementary pieces. So maybe kind of going between the communications and the tethering to the applied. I'll start and with the beginning. I'll try and put a little bit of a string and a bow to it, which is that the string was when we finally got all the data into a single analytic repository that people can make the discoveries, they then came up with the argument in order to justify the creation of some of these entity resolution models. The models themselves then begot a whole architecture and a need to be able to facilitate pipes to connect all these different data into this architecture, which then begot many of other aspects. And in some of the key other ancillary bits of that was the curation, data governance, required data sharing governance that we hadn't really had before, to be honest, really the governance component, creating a true, we'd say, analytical environment where there's standardized metrics that have gone through a whole curation process so that people aren't just willy-nilly grabbing code snippets everywhere and trying to calculate their own metric, in their own context and probably screwing it up, but a nice codified single set. So at least at this point in time, I'd say the net result was we're left with an environment where people can go to single sets to get a single view of the truth. You want to deviate, that's your issue. But at least you've got, at least you've got a standard. You can go there. And there's also now a whole suite of these kind of, again, the microservices solutions, which then can be used for all kinds of different pieces. And they're not monolithic, so you can pull out different pieces. Like if you want to use the geographic, component, you can use it over here. If you want to use, the entity resolution for organization, you can use it there. But anyway, so maybe I'll stop at that part. But I think that's kind of like that thread, is that connection
Right.
between building, creating, and democratizing.
Good. Jesse?
Yeah,
Yeah, good luck following that one.
Well, see, I got
He
an ace
can.
up my sleeve. So being DoD, I'm not going to go into specific successes and problems.
Absolutely. Right. We understand.
But we've had small and good successes so far. But I think the real success is just like you were saying, is that snowball effect. So initially, people are very skeptical about the technology. You come in, you start talking about, data governance and curation, like blah blah. Who cares? And then you do a project and it shows value. Suddenly, people are interested. It's like, okay, and you get a little more leeway, a little more room. Okay, you're going to let us stand up an experimental environment, right? Okay, now we need to start talking about governance. Okay, you've got a data model that we like, that's successful. How do we document this? What do we do with it? What controls are around it? How do we make sure the data going into it doesn't get changed as we're changing all this other data? So that snowball effect, I feel, is really important. And we have a ton of failures in the AI realm because of the data, right? We have a really good problem. We started like, the pattern didn't come back. We didn't find anything, or we didn't have enough data. And those are fantastic failures. People always get down on those, but I'm like, that is progress to me, right? Because then I'm spawning more requirements where I actually have justification to ask for these resources, right? Okay, so management, this question that you wanted to ask, wanted answered, we went out and looked, and we don't have enough data. We think if we got this data, we might get some success, and it's probably going to cost you this much. I now have justification. So once we start moving down this road, it's no longer like pie in the sky stuff. You're actually making progress towards it. So I think even if you're failing all year with all your data projects, it's still a lot of progress because you can actually put numbers and justification next to things.
Okay. Jeff?
I mean, I'll keep it brief, but I would say it's kind of the realization, and it's really maybe continue to that thread, is the realization of if you do all this work on the data side, which is not yielding any results initially, it then allows you to merge it together and yield results. And that's very difficult because there's no reward for all that work in the beginning, and it's somewhat of a guess that it's going to actually be a reward. And so, because in our case, and your case too, I'm sure, the technology can take leaps sometimes, and all that old data was kind of worthless because now our resolution's much better, and all these other, and we understand the model, the world much better, so we're doing the experiments better. So I would say that for us, it's really been the timeline when the groups that have taken that work put their data into a much more controlled environment where they can manage the data, manage the code, manage the data transformations, and gone from 2 years kind of analysis to 2 months analysis. And then everybody's like, wow, you did that. And they know these people in terms of their, they're not the IT people doing this. These are scientists doing this. So they know they're not making stuff up. And so they say, how did you do that? And they say, actually, it wasn't that hard. We did this, 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 and this. And so I think that's really what we've seen as success. You know, these minor successes yielding to people changing their kind of the paradigm from it is worth spending that time to standardize the data.
Okay. So that brings me to my next question. So like, for example, you brought up failures. So from a technical perspective, when you look at those types of things, are you able to glean out these best practices going forward? You know, by having these types of failures, or in general, from a technical perspective, you know, what have you guys come up with to say, okay, here are some best practices I should do going forward? Make sense?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't have anything really mind-boggling to say on technology. I think I'll go back to the definitions and standards that I talked about first, and quality. So before you even think about the technology, getting everything in place that you can, as much as you can, so that you know that the data is in a good condition. Then you can use the appropriate technology and make sure that you're doing the connections correctly, et cetera. And I know that we've already touched on this before, but I think having one version of the truth is also very important. So, and that usually, but not always, manifests itself as having things in one place, following the same business rules, same standards again. So I really take it back to basics, making sure you get the basics right even before you move to technology.
Okay. Damian?
I definitely agree with that. And if there's also kind of add on some aspect is that a lot of the things that are so useful are oftentimes the hardest things to argue that we should have, because it doesn't seem to have the immediate benefit, which I think kind of tethers on both these sides for the failures, but also like knowledge management. I just have to make a beef on that one for a second, because I feel like, so often people think, oh yeah, it'd be great if we could have a Google search of our SharePoint site and stuff like that. But when I look around in my office and I look at all my staff trying to figure out, like, what do you waste most of your life on? It's trying to find a stupid document, right? So you think about, there are things out there, and we always hear like certain business parties saying, ops. I want to solve operations problems. I want to make all of our staff who are in production move faster. But at the same time, it's like, yeah, but a lot of these things, there's kind of like, you have to, I kind of hate the term to some degree, but you have to build it and then they will come,
yeah.
right? But there's a lot of things that seem so hard to articulate that they're so essential, and people don't even realize it because it almost becomes like air in your environment, that you need it desperately, and nobody seems to want to fund some of these elements, but they're so critical. Anyway, so I'll definitely go on in terms of like if there's any kind of last words of wisdom on structuring, I'd absolutely say, please, dear God, spend money on things that that actually support the ground level foundation, so that you can have those failures, right? So you can even have the discoveries. You can have these moments where you can pull things together, because at least people can actually discover each other. And also, I guess, I'll go back on the microservices a bit. I know maybe being too heavy-handed on that, but too often I'd see in a lot of the different, especially with DHS and certainly some of our other sister agencies out there, they've built things so integrated that you just can't pull out those little pieces that you need. So if anyone's thinking of building or bidding for anything, please use those words, because we all like to hear that. And certainly key ideas around how do you democratize data across your agencies and across your organizations, because otherwise people can't find those discoveries.
Okay. Jesse?
I mean, since I'm in the AI realm, we find a project and a business problem and we run as fast, as hard as we can, and we just run into the constraints as we go. Sometimes we feel like a pinball. And then at the end of our project, we know the constraints. So to us, it's been all about like, can I get my pinky toe into the door, right? And can I open that door a little bit with every project? So, back in the spring, we had to beg, borrow, and steal to get some compute power for a project, right? Project, might fail, but we got the ability to show what we could do with the data. Even if the project fails, we're going to answer a question, right? Because it doesn't have to be a yes to the question management's answering. It can be I don't know, or no, or we could need these things. But as long as we have movement, I can find out what the constraints are. So asking for something, without being able to show what it could do or if it's going to hamper you is really super hard sell in this business, right? I want to do an experiment. I don't know if it's going to work out. Can you give me a bunch of money? Not going to happen. If I can do a small experiment, tell you why it failed and how much money I need, that's a different question. So I think just doing anything with the data that you can get, figuring out all the constraints, identifying the ones that, if solved, can give you the biggest ROI, gives you a ton of ammunition to keep moving. I think it's going to be a lot of iteration. I don't think anyone's just going to come and give you a bunch of money. Okay. If you are, well, let me know where you work.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't really have a technical answer, but I think for us, what made the transformation is when we really changed the process and put in the plan, do, check, act kind of model, which allowed us to really have a kind of a quick cycle. And then really we were able to, in the next few years, look at the culture and address this fear of failure that had been there, and then really said, failure is part of the process, and you're not really trying if you don't fail. So I think then also being able to just bring kind of problem assessments, so that in the plan, do, check cycle, you're kind of then presenting, this is what happened, this is what worked, this is what didn't work, and this is why we think this didn't work. And often it then allows you to go underneath and say, hey, we don't have knowledge. Hey, our ops is not really as good as we thought it was, or our contracts take too long to get in place. Well, that's a given fact. But you're able to kind of go a little bit more root cause And then people get they just get freer because they see, okay, well, let's work on those things. They don't really kind of feel like it's a self-failure. Okay. And so I think that to us is, I mean, how else are we going to work? We don't work in a stable world, right? Everything, technology is changing. Everything in cancer research is changing. And so you just have to do that. Otherwise, you just kind of get stuck in the past.
Right. Okay, cool. Well, I don't have any more questions. What I wanted to do for the remaining minutes was just get your guys' thoughts on your environment and, this particular industry and what's going on in this environment. So with that, I'll let you get started.
Sure. So I guess some of the key takeaways that I have, and kind of keying off my colleagues here, really embracing the experimental model and being okay with failure is very important, because that's such an opportunity to learn and get better. I'll also say that on the leadership side, when I've seen leaders be more effective with data, it's when they're open-minded about what the data will tell them, because many times data is not going to it's not going to give you a rosy picture, and leaders that embrace that and use that as an opportunity to do something are ones that I see that are really successful with data. I'll also say that I think we have a tendency to talk about data as if it's an emerging function, and certainly the technologies are changing at a rapid pace. There's a lot of innovation going on, but the basics of data management have really been known for a long time, and those don't really change. So I think we really know what to do, and it's just a matter of doing it, focusing on it, getting the basics in place before we buy that technology or go down the path of a new type of data analysis. There are some things that just don't change.
Okay. Thank you.
I'll throw this out, kind of the tie between actually can you have cheap failures, but also it goes back to a challenge actually, because I'm thinking of an OPM conversation just last week about should we have a new series for data scientists that's not 1530 or 1515 or what are the other series that are out there. Key problem. One, in many shops that I've seen, OIT seems to think if you're doing code, you're a developer, and therefore you must be a 2201, you must be on the IT side of the fence. And if you're doing code, then you shouldn't be doing it because you're not in IT. But the reality is if you're doing data science, if you're doing machine learning, if you're doing SAS code or Python or R, I'm sorry, but you need the tools that are allowing it. So a lot of the things that, in terms of a challenge, I wish IT environments would say, no, it's okay for people on the business side to have things like Macintoshes or other types of coding technologies so they can actually do their stupid work, right? So that's kind of like a breakdown. But then also where IT can definitely help, so that the hint, wink, wink to the future in terms of installations, please look at solutions that allow data scientists to be data scientists. Example, right, if you have to go to IT to set up a cluster computing environment in AWS and spin up a whole EMR cluster, right, that's just not going to work because that takes too long and it's too expensive. But there are a number of different technologies out there, such as like Databricks and other stuff. I'm not naming names, I'm just putting out as an example, that do allow you to, for instance, the data scientist, without having to have that horrible tether to other bureaucratic parts of the organization to spin up a cluster including an environment, to test a problem, to have that wonderful, actually juicy failure that actually helps you lead to that next thing that actually is a win. Well, then now you have a good environment for people to be creative, to have cheap failures, and to actually be creative and do what they need to do and find solutions.
You need better IT.
Tell me about it. Well, then you can help me out.
All right, Jesse.
I like to back out, and just with the remaining time that we have, what are we trying to do? We're trying to solve business problems.
True.
We do need to fix the data. We do need to use data science, but let's be agnostic about it. What problem am I trying to solve? If we never fix our data and we never do AI and they get rid of me and all the other data scientists, but we solve the business problems, that's fine with me. So, we get wrapped up in the technology all the time. We need blockchain, we need AI, we need data science, we need servers, blah, blah, blah. What's the business problem? It all has to start with business problem. If your constraint isn't coming from a business problem, then it's not a real constraint.
Gotcha. Okay, good. Okay. Jeff,
I would
close
say,
us out, big guy.
yeah, sure. I would say for us, it's really kind of juggling this act in healthcare with the research and the drive to help people live a more full life, and this really new push to privacy, and so you would think, right? You would think that it's possible to have people who have cancer, to follow them. None of that is possible, right? Nearly impossible. And so even though we have the National Cancer Act, and even though we have, when you get cancer, you go into a registry in the state, and that's all collected at the federal level, tracking you from then on is there's no way to really do that. And we are, so I think it's really kind of that. I mean, I like turning action into data. Now ours is maybe turning data we want to turn action into data. Sorry, I said the punchline.
Thanks a lot. I appreciate that.
So I think for us, it's really preparing for the future and getting our ecosystem ready. We have to get the ecosystem ready because we have no way to deal with the privacy, deal with the amount of data, and then deal with dealing with actually paying for it in an effective way.
Okay. All right. All right, guys, in closing, I want to thank you guys for being a part of the panel. Should I ask any questions of the audience, or how do you want to do it? Okay. Anybody have any questions for the panel? Gentleman here.
So the question is, each of you talked about your specific data sets. Each of you talked about your specific data sets and then curating data. Now take a look at it from a whole government perspective. The volume of data across your organizations is phenomenal. So where do you see the challenges if each of you is curating your data into different standards and such? How do you get to a whole government?
Which one of you guys want to answer that?
I can. You want to go for something?
I'll take a quick crack. So, we're asking that same problem in the DoD right now, right? Ton of agencies everywhere. I'm in the fourth estate, multiple agencies. We all need access to each other's data to solve these emerging problems and questions that we've never been able to ask before. If I had the answer to that question, I'd probably be really rich, because that's something we're trying to figure out. And I don't think you can figure out how to do it on a government-wide basis until you figure out how to do it in your own agency yourself. And so if there's some agency or government agency who has cracked the code on, this is exactly how we do it, we laid out all the processes, I think that's where we have to start. Finding those best practices in government, right? Because we're not public companies. Like a lot of public companies figured it out. We can't do it that way because we have laws. If we find an agency that's done it and done it successfully, I think taking those best practices is probably our best approach.
Okay.
I'll throw one element that if we're trying to attempt to even approach that, what we've been attempting to do, saying, look, who has already kind of begun to solve the problem slightly? So like you think of like the NEEM standards, NIEM, NIST. And internally, we've been trying to come up with JSON standards. So at least when things get put onto messaging queues like Kafka or some other technology from moving data around the environment, that at least hopefully please people stick to at least one kind of standard. Like what are the naming conventions, again, the JSON standards for moving that data around within the environment. And we're hoping, dear God, we can get the rest of DHS and other parties to kind of play ball with us on those elements. But yes, if we could then get beyond just our one agency, go to other folks. I'd be like, if I could get some of his, Internet of Things data, on building, that would be great. We could really optimize some cool stuff,
So, I'll just add to that. I think that the same sort of logic applies in terms of making sure that the business questions. So what are the government-wide challenges where we really need common data? And then I think you should look to the communities themselves to help to develop those standards. And there's some examples of how that's happening right now with federal geographic data, for example. the communities really should be the ones that are defining that, getting together, and that definitely, if we need to have our own houses in order before we can do that, and I think everybody's got some work to do there.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, I just want to add, you just want to be careful about unintended consequences that we didn't think of because we never had this data before. Like when the soldiers were wearing the Fitbits and, oh, we know where they are exactly. And so as you start to bring this data in, all of a sudden you'll see, oh, wow, we never saw the world this way before. So I think we just want to make sure that we're thinking about it enough, because otherwise what will happen is then all of a sudden you won't be able to share the data, like we are in a lot lot of situations, and then, and then we'll be in a kind of a worse place. We won't be disorganized, we'll be like cut off.
Right, yeah.
Okay. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being here.